Recently, I have been living in a small apartment in a one-story house on Cherry Street. This is an old district of the city, a private sector populated mainly by older people leading a quiet and measured lifestyle. I thought of them as Aborigines. There are also quite a few drunks living in huts so ancient that they have already half gone underground. During the day they crawl out to shoot supermarket change, and in the evening they gather in companies to share their high-grade loot. Most of them are quite quiet, although there are exceptions, which I am even too well aware of, since absolutely everything that happens within a block radius can be heard through an open window on the first floor. In our latitudes, sleeping with the window closed becomes completely impossible from the middle of April. The first hot southern nights attract all the local lumpants into their velvet embrace, who organize their simple carousals with a vengeance and purity, recouping for all the winter months. In general, except for periodic night parties, the area is very quiet and calm, so open windows do not interfere with sleep at all. During the couple of weeks that I have been living here, I have learned to fall asleep even to the noise of passing cars, the footsteps of rare night passers-by, snatches of conversations and inarticulate drunken screams on the corner. Sometimes night sounds are knocked out of the usual spectrum, which my brain has learned to filter out and pull out of half-sleep for a few seconds. Usually it's a passing 9, rocking the whole neighborhood with a patsy bass and announcing its arrival with a deafening roar of a direct current. A sudden, very distinct word that a passerby talking on the phone uttered exactly opposite the window. A couple of dashing schoolchildren with a Bluetooth speaker and one can of beer for two and other noisy, but quite everyday irritants. After paying a second's attention to them, I continue to fall asleep as if nothing had happened. However, some sounds can be difficult to explain, especially to the falling asleep brain. For example, one day a music source flashed past the window, playing as if backwards. Judging by the speed, it was a cyclist, but I didn't hear him coming. The music started playing right under my window and faded away a few seconds later. Pennywise rides, I chuckled to myself, writing off the abrupt beginning of the eruption of music to the malfunction of the speaker, and the demonic reverse to the Doppler effect and the fantasies of the falling asleep brain. Another time I heard the sound of a car tire rolling on the sidewalk. It was as if someone was carrying her, and then decided to throw her forward for fun. She bounced a few times, then rolled past my window and fell on her side with a characteristic cyclical sound. It is noteworthy that I did not hear any steps of the possible owner of the tire. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere and rolled by herself. And when I left the house the next morning, of course, there was no tire on the sidewalk. Such cases drive away sleep, make me sit up on my elbow and listen intently for a while to what is happening outside the window, wondering whether studying a strange case is worth getting out of bed. I usually make a decision in favor of the bed, and even if I get up and go to the window, I don't notice anything unusual. In addition, these events are never repeated, or rather, have not been repeated until recently. Compared to other cases, the new sound was not too strange. Just a cyclist who rang the bicycle bell at regular intervals. According to my calculations, exactly 3 seconds. Unlike the case of Pennywise, his call came from afar and disappeared in the distance. I decided that this was some crazy old lady going on a bike ride at night, signaling to her alone, visible creatures from the fantasy world. There was another oddity with this sound. The volume of the call was not increasing at a constant rate. The period of 3 seconds remained unchanged, but at some moments the cyclist seemed to start going in the opposite direction, and without wasting time on a U-turn. For example, there were 3 calls, the first was quieter, the second louder. The cyclist was approaching, and the third with the same volume as the first. In such a short time, he would hardly have had time to turn around. The cyclist started his race shortly after midnight at a distance of about 1 block from my window. Then, with such jerks back and forth, after about 5 minutes, he reached my window, after which he was removed in the same time. Sometimes I fell asleep earlier and didn't hear him. If I happened to sit up for several nights in a row, I noticed that he appeared every second night. As you know, 10 minutes of annoying ringing does not help to fall asleep. Usually I just wait for him to quiet down, tossing and turning in bed with displeasure. But one night, when, according to my calculations, he was supposed to appear, I decided to wait for him at the window and finally see the mysterious cyclist. The ringing started at the usual time. I opened the curtains and sat on the windowsill, waiting for the cyclist to appear. He was approaching with habitual jerks, and now that I was sitting closer to the window and was not half asleep, this behavior seemed even more strange to me. At the moments when the cyclist changed the direction of movement, the approaching buzzing of the wheels stopped for a moment and immediately resumed, already fading away, as if he instantly braked and started pedaling in the opposite direction. The same thing happened when the cyclist should have already, judging by the volume of the bell, entered my field of vision. He braked, I even heard a short squeak of the tire on the asphalt and moved back. 2 calls later, he drove forward again. And again, right before showing up from behind a parked truck, the tires creaked briefly and drove back. As if he knows I'm watching him, I thought. I wonder how long he'll be riding back and forth. It turned out not for long. The next brake squeak was not followed by the whirring of wheels. The bell continued to diligently count down for 3 seconds, standing still, judging by the sound, just behind the truck. I leaned out of the open window, trying to look behind the truck, but the sharp creak of bicycle tires announced to me that the stranger had moved back. As soon as I returned to my previous position, he moved forward again. I was captured by something like excitement, the nature of the tester, and the fact that a cyclist can hardly feel my field of vision in order to always stay on its edge did not arouse suspicion in me. I repeated the peeking operation a few more times to make sure he always moved away, hiding behind the truck. Then I decided to conduct a new experiment. He got up from the windowsill and walked away from the window, pressing his back against the wall. The cyclist moved forward as expected. In a few seconds, when, according to my calculations, he should have been right in front of the window, where there was nowhere to hide. I spun around and stared out the window. The cyclist seemed to be waiting for me all the time and was not going anywhere at all. He was standing right under a street lamp, leaning on one leg, and looking straight ahead. I couldn't understand how he managed to stop so quickly and take such a relaxed pose. His left hand continued to regularly count down exactly 3 seconds on the bicycle bell, as if obeying an invisible metronome. The cyclist himself was a man of pre-retirement age, of solid build, dressed in trousers with arrows, black shoes and a thick jacket. On his head was a checkered 8-link cap. His face was covered with gray-streaked stubble. He wears thick horn-rimmed glasses. A typical aborigine, decent, not from lumpen. I've been looking at it for 3 calls. I don't like people looking at me, he said, still looking ahead. And the next moment, his head exploded with a deafening roar. Fragments of cheeks scattered in different directions, teeth flashed, flying out somewhere from the other side of the face. The eyes popped out of their sockets, the skull opened like a coconut, exposing the scarlet flesh. His whole body shuddered and sagged like a piece of meat wrapped in leather, rolled back over the seat and dragged the bike with him. having fallen to the ground in a useless pile of meat, bones and iron, sprinkled with scarlet. I watched this picture in a complete stupor. Suddenly, all the unreality of the events of the last few minutes piled on me, and I thought that this must be some kind of hallucination, delusions, and there really is no cyclist. Neither is his corpse with a severed head. But the completely naturalistic view of a dead body entangled in a bicycle convinced me otherwise. I was brought out of my stupor by my grandfather, who appeared around the corner. He was wearing old blue tights with stretched knees and slippers, his torso was bare. In his hand he held a hunting saiga. I recognized him. He probably lived somewhere in the neighborhood. We occasionally greeted each other on the street, although I didn't know his name. Grandpa looked at the corpse and then at me. "They don't like to be looked at," he groaned reproachfully, addressing me. "Did you shoot?" I asked stupidly. "Yeah. But why? And if you saw him, he won't leave you alone." "And who is he?" "An aborigine." I shuddered at the familiar word. I don't remember calling the locals aborigines except to myself. "What kind of aborigine, and why won't he leave me alone?" "Aborigines are those who sometimes play pranks here at night." "Who has been living here for a long time, in wooden barracks, in rickety ruins, in houses about which you will think that they have been abandoned for a long time, or there is some dying old woman without grandchildren lying without getting up. But in fact, they were here before us. And after us they will be." Then it became clear to me that my grandfather was just crazy and shot a cyclist, obeying the whim of his senile senility, possibly fueled by excessive alcohol consumption. Compared to this, the eccentricity of the cyclist seemed to me just an innocent prank. You never know, a person took it into his head to drive back and forth along the street, he did not interfere with anyone, but the grandfather and his gun judged differently. "Don't look at me like a wolf," the old man continued in his slow, raspy voice, looking into my eyes. "I did you a favor. Do you know what would happen? He would call now every night, and then under your window he would only call. And then not just under the window. And maybe not only would he call, who knows?" I shuddered. Grandfather is also catching up with horror. "I'll call the police," I said. "Don't strain yourself, they've already called. Good night." Grandfather turned around and shuffled away, leaving me in horror and stupor. The police actually showed up 10 minutes later. I decided that it was better not to wait for someone to knock on my door, got dressed and went outside myself. He told them that he had seen a cyclist and how his neighbor's grandfather had shot him for no reason. I didn't know his apartment number, but I often saw him on the street, so he must live somewhere nearby. After making sure that neither I nor I had a weapon at home, the staff took me to the department to testify. And the investigator promised to find a similar grandfather among the neighbors. I returned from the department only in the morning and slept until the evening. Nothing remarkable happened for the next few days. I was sitting at home, recovering from the experience. Fortunately, the police didn't touch me. Maybe they found the grandfather and he confessed everything? Or maybe I still have to talk to them. On the third night, when I was tossing and turning in bed and had almost fallen into an anxious sleep, a conversation was heard outside the window. Judging by the voices, a small group of schoolchildren decided to stop and have a smoke, not finding a better place for this than right under my window. The headshot weighed him down, as much as Yushka splashed, a guy of 15 years old was telling with inspiration, judging by the breaking voice. Someone spat. I rolled over on my side, trying to hide from the annoying sounds with a pillow. Does it turn out that someone saw him? Or why is it so? A female voice, a teenage girl, I saw it. The one who lives here. Who listens to us, or what? The second voice of the boy, cleaner, apparently younger, cut in. Well, yes, the first one grinned. Hi, by the way, the girl said playfully. All three fell silent. Hello, I say, the first voice barked hoarsely, as if right in my ear. I jumped. The trees rustled softly outside the window. In the case of schoolchildren, my sleep regime finally destroyed. Of course, after the murder of a cyclist by a neighbor's grandfather, I listened every night to what was happening outside the window, catching any strange sounds, but still by 3 o'clock I managed to fall asleep. Now, the exhausted brain completely refused to turn off, continuing to work at idle, scrolling over and over again pictures of the dangers lurking behind the slightly open window. Although the closed window protected from night noises, it also did not contribute to a healthy sleep. After 15 minutes, the stuffiness in the room became unbearable, and I, sweating profusely, still got up to open it a crack. Insomnia gives everything a touch of unreality. And when I went out for groceries in the afternoon, I saw my grandfather, the shooter, peacefully watering a flower bed with a hose. This mundane scene seemed to me something psychotic. Good afternoon, I greeted cautiously. Great, neighbor. Grandfather squeaked without looking up from his occupation. I hesitated, choosing the right words carefully. How did it go with the police that night? Grandfather lowered the hose, from which water continued to flow. He never turned to me. No way. No one came to see me. Of course, the investigator said that they would collect the testimony of all the neighbors. Testimony. You probably won't come to me so easily. He grunted contentedly and directed the hose back to the flower bed. And you live in the 6th apartment? I poked at random. In the sixth, he mumbled and lowered the hose again. Something was wrong. I stepped back, watching my grandfather. After a few seconds, he raised the hose, then lowered it again. I felt dizzy. Have a nice day, I said goodbye. And you. I turned around and walked towards the store, listening to the fading murmur of water behind me. The sound changed when the grandfather raised and lowered the hose. The interval between these actions was exactly 9 seconds. And, of course, there was no 6th apartment in our house. That night I decided not to torment myself trying to fall asleep. In the evening, he settled down in an armchair with a huge mug of tea or began to read a book, diligently immersing himself in a fictional world in order to distract himself a little from the madness around him. It worked out well. Inflamed by insomnia and strange events, my brain vividly drew everything described on the pages, and I soon lost track of time. My meditative leisure was interrupted by a knock on the window. I shuddered and looked up at the curtains. Repeated knocking confirmed that it wasn't my imagination. I went to the window and opened the curtains. A neighbor's grandfather was looking at me from the street. He bared his yellowish teeth in a smile. Hello, neighbor. He squeaked cheerfully. Good night, I replied cautiously. Open the window. I usually put the window on airing and almost never opening it completely, and in light of recent events, I absolutely did not want to do this. Did something happen? Give me a cigarette. What cigarette? It's night outside, I replied irritably. That's it. The shops are closed, but I want to smoke, grandfather retorted. I stared at his smiling flabby face, trying to figure out what was really going on here. I would say that the whole scene seemed like a dream to me. But lately, the difference between sleeping and waking has become too insignificant. We looked at each other for a few seconds. You do realize I don't need an invitation to come in, right? I rushed to the window and slammed it shut. Grandfather did not move, continuing to smile. I left the room, took out my mobile and dialed the emergency number. I told the operator that a neighbor who is suspected of a recent murder was breaking into my house. And even if it wasn't entirely true, but now I would prefer to spend the night in the department, giving an explanation to an irritated policeman. Surrounded by sane people and bright light than at home with a crazy grandfather outside the window. The operator announced in a tired voice that the outfit had left. I went back into the room. And the window was open. Grandfather was standing inside, leaning against the wall. A familiar saiga glittered in his hands. "And you're cozy," he said in a matter-of-fact tone, as if resuming an interrupted dialogue. "How did you get in here?" I slowly backed away from him. "I didn't climb anywhere. Street. The place is public." "Grandpa, you're in my apartment." "Is it how to see where your apartment starts?" "You think you came here, put an iron door, a fashionable double-glazed window. That's it, separated? Are you free?" No, man, that's not how it works here. The owners are different here. Old masters. Those who built these houses hundreds of years ago." "What hosts? What hundreds of years ago? What are you talking about?" "Aborigines, then," my grandfather replied calmly. "Who has been here for centuries? They are the masters here, and you're like that, a stray bird." I was beginning to catch the logic of the crazy grandfather and hoped that I would be able to chat him up until the police arrived. "And you, then, are an aborigine, and I, therefore. You shot one, as you say, an aborigine a couple of days ago. So he broke the rules. You cannot get caught in the eye during the Makion, otherwise you will either have to make your own witness, or get rid of him. And then, you see, everyone will find out about our routine, they will not give us a living." I especially didn't like the word "get rid of." "What kind of Makion? So this is what the whole way of life is built on. Walk the dog in the evening, ride a bike, drink tea on the veranda. The main thing is to do everything according to the schedule, clearly, like in the army. 1-2. Grandfather perked up, took his saiga on his shoulder and playfully saluted. Then I remembered how my grandfather watered the flower bed during the day. "Why did you turn pale?" "Yes, and you've seen my emotion. So I've come to settle our business with you. To talk, as they say, in a neighborly way. What do you want from me? You need to decide. Will you settle down, will you live with us in your own way, as from time immemorial, and until the end of time it is customary? Or you will continue, like a bird, flitting from place to place, not knowing your land, not knowing the routes. And if I don't want to live with you? So I've already said what will happen." Grandfather frowned. The noise of an approaching car was heard outside the window. Blue and red flashed behind the curtains. Grandfather pointed the gun at me. "Decide, man." The whole whirlwind of recent events unfolded in my head in full force. I stood mesmerized by the muzzle of the gun, physically unable to realize anything, much less decide. A heavy knock on the door brought me out of my stupor. "I'm staying," I said, as if in a trance. Grandfather lowered the gun and laughed. "That's right, neighbor, that's right." The knock was repeated. "It seems you have uninvited guests. You know what good hosts do to uninvited guests." I nodded and reached out to take the gun.